The evidence against Joseph Duggar is about as close to airtight as a criminal case gets. There are two separate verbal admissions. There is a forensic interview conducted by a trained specialist. There is a victim who is prepared to testify, and yet his defense attorney walked into court and demanded a jury trial anyway. Tonight we are going inside that decision because it is not as irrational as it sounds. In fact, when you understand the three specific windows the defense is targeting, you will realize this trial has more legal suspense in it than almost anyone covering it has bothered to explain. If you are new here, hit like and subscribe right now, because this channel goes deeper into the legal mechanics of cases like this than anywhere else on YouTube, and what is coming in the next few minutes is going to completely change how you think about this trial. Let us start with the impossible position Joseph Duggar's defense attorney is actually in, because understanding the position explains everything about the strategy. You cannot be a defense attorney in this case and pretend the admissions did not happen. You cannot stand up in front of a jury and say your client never said what multiple people heard him say. That road is closed. You cannot attack the forensic interview as if it never occurred, because the recording exists and the jury will likely see it. You cannot put your client on the stand to tell his side of the story, because the moment he sits in that witness chair, the prosecution gets to cross-examine him about everything, and everything in this case does not work in his favor. So what can you actually do? What is the realistic, honest answer to that question? The answer is cross-examination. That is the tool. That is the entire weapon in the defense arsenal when the evidence is this strong. Cross-examination is the art of questioning the prosecution's own witnesses in ways that plant seeds of doubt in the minds of jurors, not by disproving facts, but by recontextualizing them, by making the jury wonder not whether something happened, but whether what they are being told happened is being presented with complete accuracy, whether every procedural step was followed correctly, whether every word attributed to the defendant was documented with precision, whether the process that produced this evidence was as clean and unimpeachable as the prosecution wants them to believe. That is where this defense lives, not in innocence, in doubt. And here is the thing that most legal commentators are not saying clearly enough. Reasonable doubt does not require a jury to believe the defendant is innocent. It only requires them to be uncertain enough that they cannot say they are sure. Those are very different standards. A juror can believe Joseph Duggar probably did what he is accused of and still vote not guilty if they believe the evidence presented to them has enough procedural questions around it that they cannot be absolutely certain of every element the prosecution must prove. That gap between probably and certainly is where defense attorneys live and breathe. That is the territory Saulene is mapping right now. Let us go through the three cross-examination windows the defense has identified, because each one is different in character, different in risk, and different in the specific type of doubt it is designed to generate. The first window is the detective's notes, and this is arguably the most legally productive target in the entire case. Here is why. Joseph Duggar made a verbal admission before he was formally charged. That admission was made to law enforcement in what appears to have been a voluntary conversation, not a formal interrogation with a Miranda warning attached. Not a recorded statement captured on video, but a conversation. And here is the question that defense attorneys are trained to ask about every voluntary pre-arrest statement. How was it documented? If the detective's notes are reconstructed from memory rather than verbatim transcription, if the conversation was not recorded on body camera or audio equipment, if the documentation happened after the fact rather than in real time, then there is a question, not a devastating question, not a question that makes the admission disappear, but a question that allows the defense to stand in front of the jury and say, you are being told that my client used specific words. You are being told that the meaning of those words was unambiguous, but the person telling you that wrote it down later from memory without a recording to verify. And word choice in a case like this matters enormously. The difference between someone saying, yes, I did that, and someone saying something more ambiguous, something that a frightened person might say to stop a confrontation, is not a trivial difference. It is the difference between a confession and an equivocal statement that has been interpreted as a confession. The defense cannot prove Joseph said something different, but they do not need to. They only need to make a juror wonder. Cross-examining a detective on the precision of their documentation is a standard defense tactic, and it is one that does not carry the same emotional risk as attacking a victim or a victim's family member. Detectives are professionals. They expect to be questioned about their process. Juries understand that law enforcement can be challenged on procedure without the implication being that the detective is a liar. The cross-examination can be sharp and pointed without feeling cruel. That combination, legally productive and low social risk with the jury, is exactly what the defense needs here. The second window is the forensic interview, and this one is more technical, more expensive to execute properly, and more limited in what it can realistically achieve. But it is not zero. Forensic interviews of minor victims are conducted according to established protocols. The most widely used is the NICS-TAP protocol, which provides a structured, research-based framework for interviewing children and adolescents about alleged abuse in ways designed to minimize suggestion and maximize accuracy. When those protocols are followed correctly, the resulting interview is about as reliable as a child witness interview can be. Courts treat properly conducted forensic interviews with significant evidentiary weight for good reason. But the word correctly is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Defense attorneys who specialize in these cases retain their own experts, forensic interview methodology specialists who will review the recording of the interview and analyze it, sometimes literally frame by frame, looking for procedural deviations. Was there any pre-interview contact between the interviewer and the victim's parents or guardians that could have introduced suggestion before the interview even began? Were all the required neutral, open-ended prompts used in the proper sequence? Were there any moments where the interviewer's language could be characterized even marginally as leading? Were there any non-verbal cues, any phrasing, any framing of questions that deviated from the protocol in ways a defense expert could point to and say, this step was not followed exactly as the research requires? The goal is not to prove the victim is lying. Let that be absolutely clear, because this distinction matters enormously for how the jury receives this line of attack. The goal is to raise a question about whether the process through which the account was captured met the standard that gives it the evidentiary reliability the prosecution is claiming. A slight deviation from protocol does not mean the account is false, but it gives the defense an argument, not a winning argument in most cases, but an argument that the method was not as rigorous as the prosecution implies, and that the jury should weigh the interview's content with that in mind. Will this work? Probably not as a standalone strategy. Forensic interviewers are trained to testify under cross-examination and to explain their methodology clearly to juries who have no background in child psychology. A skilled interviewer on the stand is a formidable prosecution witness precisely because they can explain why every choice they made was justified and professionally grounded. But if the defense expert can identify even one specific concrete procedural deviation, not a general critique of the process, but a specific moment where the protocol was not followed, it gives the defense something to point to in closing argument. Something specific is harder to dismiss than something general. And in a case where the defense needs one juror to hold out, specific is everything. The third window is the victim's father, and this is where the defense strategy gets genuinely delicate. Because the father heard Joseph's admission directly in a confrontation that happened before law enforcement was involved. His account of what Joseph said is part of the prosecution's case. And unlike the detective, who is a professional trained to document statements precisely, the father is a parent, a human being who had just received devastating information about someone he had known and possibly trusted, and who was operating in a state of profound emotional distress when that confrontation took place. So Aline's cross-examination of the father will need to probe carefully the circumstances of that confrontation. What exact words were used in the question put to Joseph? What exact words did Joseph use in response? Did Joseph use the word yes, or did he use language that was more ambiguous? Language that the father, in his emotional state, interpreted as an admission because he was desperate for one? Did the confrontation continue until the father felt he had received a clear answer? Is it possible that the father's emotional investment in the outcome of that conversation shaped how he heard and remembered the response? These are not comfortable questions. The defense attorney asking them knows they are not comfortable. The jury will feel protective of a father who is trying to protect his family. Any cross-examination that feels like an attack on the father's character, his credibility as a father, or his motives will backfire immediately. Jurors will close off to the defense the moment they feel like the attorney is trying to make this man look like a villain for confronting someone who had harmed his child. But the questions themselves, stripped of aggression, asked with genuine procedural focus rather than personal attack, are legally legitimate. They are not asking whether the father was lying. They are asking whether the father's account of exactly what was said and exactly how it was said is as precise as a trained investigator's account would be. And the answer, honestly, is that it is probably not. Not because the father is dishonest, but because no ordinary person in that emotional state has the training or the presence of mind to document a confrontation with verbatim precision. That gap between what the father believes he heard and what the defense can argue might have been said is small, but small gaps are all Sauline needs. Now let us talk about what the defense must absolutely avoid, because understanding the risks is as important as understanding the strategy. The single most catastrophic mistake available to the defense in this case is allowing the jury to perceive the cross-examination as an attack on the victim's credibility. Florida law restricts certain lines of cross-examination when the victim is a minor. But beyond the legal restrictions, there is a practical reality that overrides everything else. A jury that feels like a defense attorney is bullying a teenage girl, suggesting she fabricated or exaggerated her account, or trying to make her out to be unreliable. That jury is done. Whatever goodwill the defense has built through careful procedural questioning of the detective or the forensic interviewer evaporates instantly the moment the jury believes the defense is trying to harm the victim a second time. This is the tightest needle the defense must thread, creating enough procedural doubt to hang the jury without triggering the protective instincts of 12 people who are sitting in the courtroom thinking about the human being at the center of this case. The defense strategy lives entirely in the space between those two realities. Step too far toward the victim and the jury turns on you. Stay entirely in the procedural weeds and you may not generate enough doubt to matter. The calibration is everything, which brings us to the defense's witness list, and the honest answer here is that it will probably be short. The options are limited and each one carries significant risk. A forensic interview methodology expert is the most professionally defensible choice, someone with academic credentials who can stand in front of the jury and provide a technical critique of the interview process without appearing to attack the victim personally. This is the cleanest witness the defense has available. The risk is that the prosecution's expert will likely be more credentialed, more practiced on the stand, and more persuasive to a lay jury. Character witnesses, pastors, community members, people who can testify to Joseph Duggar's standing in his faith community present a different kind of risk. In any ordinary criminal case, character testimony can be valuable. In this case, with the Josh Duggar conviction in the immediate background, calling character witnesses who knew or associated with the broader Duggar family opens a door the defense would almost certainly prefer to keep closed. The prosecution is entitled to cross-examine character witnesses about whether the Josh Duggar conviction affected their view of the family's character. A character witness who has to answer that question on cross-examination is not helping the defense. They are giving the jury a fresh reminder of a closely related criminal conviction in the middle of a trial where the defense is trying to generate doubt. And Joseph Duggar himself will almost certainly not testify. This is not even a close call. Putting a defendant on the stand when the prosecution has verbal admissions, a forensic interview and a willing victim witness is not a strategy, it is a surrender. Cross-examination of the defendant would allow the prosecution to revisit every element of the admitted conduct in open court with no procedural shield available and no way to control how the jury receives it. The Fifth Amendment exists precisely for situations like this. Joseph Duggar will invoke it. So what is the real goal here? Let us be precise about this because it changes how you watch this trial. The defense's realistic goal is not a not guilty verdict. I want to say that plainly because it matters. Given the evidence, the admissions, the forensic interview, the victim's willingness to testify, the statistical probability of a full acquittal on all counts is very low. Defense attorneys who are honest with themselves and their clients know when the evidence points toward conviction. Joseph Duggar's attorney knows what the evidence looks like. The realistic goal is a hung jury. One holdout, one juror out of 12 who has absorbed the procedural questions about the detective's notes, the forensic interview methodology, and the father's account, and who has enough doubt, not certainty of innocence, but enough doubt to refuse to vote guilty. One person who says, I cannot be completely sure, I have questions, I am not comfortable saying beyond a reasonable doubt. One person is all it takes to prevent a unanimous verdict, and a mistrial is not an acquittal, but it is not a conviction either. It buys time, it opens a new window for plea negotiation, it exhausts prosecution resources, it resets the clock. This is the hidden logic behind demanding a jury trial when the evidence is this strong. Defense attorneys who demand jury trials in cases like this are not being irrational. They are playing a specific, calculated game with a specific, achievable goal. They are not trying to win, they are trying to prevent the prosecution from winning unanimously. And if they can get to one juror, one person who has heard the procedural questions, felt some uncertainty, and decided they cannot vote guilty with complete confidence, they have achieved something the evidence seemed to make impossible. The cross-examination strategy is calibrated specifically for that one person, not for the 12 people who walk into that courtroom already knowing in their gut what happened. For the one person who walks in as a genuine holdout, someone analytical, someone who cares about process, someone who takes the phrase beyond a reasonable doubt literally and seriously, the detective's notes question is aimed at that person. The forensic interview methodology question is aimed at that person. The father's account question is aimed at that person. Every procedural probe, every narrow technical challenge, every careful word choice in the cross-examination is designed to give that one juror something to hold on to when the other 11 look at them and say, how can you not vote guilty when the evidence is this clear? The answer the defense wants the juror to have is, because I have questions about the process and I cannot set those questions aside. Now let us study the case study that Sauline has almost certainly spent time analysing, Josh Duggar's trial, and specifically what his defence attorneys did wrong on cross-examination, because the mistakes there are instructive. Josh Duggar's legal team made a specific aggressive cross-examination argument that the digital forensic evidence in that case had been contaminated or planted by an unknown third party. This was not a narrow procedural challenge. This was a broad alternative narrative that required the jury to accept that someone else had accessed Josh Duggar's computer and placed illegal art material on it, without the defense being able to name who that person was, prove they had access, or provide any concrete evidence of their claim. The jury rejected that argument in under 7 hours, not because digital forensic evidence is beyond challenge, it is not, and skilled defense experts have successfully challenged digital forensics in other cases, but because the specific argument the defense made required the jury to accept an implausible alternative explanation supported by no concrete evidence, offered by attorneys who appeared desperate rather than precise. The claim felt like a Hail Mary, and when a defense argument feels like a Hail Mary, juries dismiss it. Not just the argument, the defense. The moment a jury decides the attorney is throwing things at the wall hoping something sticks, they stop listening to the procedural questions that might actually have merit. Sauline has studied this, or if he has not, he should have, and any competent defense attorney in Florida would have. The lesson is restrained, specific, technically precise cross-examination is harder for the prosecution to dismiss and harder for the jury to ignore than broad alternative narratives. You do not tell the jury someone else did it when you cannot prove who. You do not claim the evidence was contaminated when you cannot show how. You ask narrow, precise questions about documentation, about protocol, about the exact words used in an emotionally charged confrontation. You do not build a new story. You create small cracks in the existing one. The dilemma, and let us be honest about this, is that restrained cross-examination also generates less dramatic doubt. A big alternative narrative, if it works, gives the jury a completely different story to latch onto. Narrow procedural questions only generate uncertainty around the edges of the existing story. They do not replace it, they only complicate it slightly. And for most jurors, slightly complicated evidence that points clearly in one direction is still evidence that points clearly in one direction. The doubt has to find a home in that one juror who is genuinely analytical and genuinely troubled by process. The other 11, the procedural questions may not be enough. That is the honest assessment of where this defense strategy lands. It is not a strategy built for winning. It is a strategy built for surviving, for extending the fight, for finding the one crack in the foundation that prevents the building from falling all at once. Whether the crack is in the detective's notes, in the forensic interview protocol, or in the father's account of the confrontation, that is the question the defense is still trying to answer as this trial moves forward. If you had to rank the 3 windows by likelihood of actually landing, or actually finding something substantive enough to move that one analytical juror, the detective's notes are probably the strongest. Not because law enforcement in Florida is sloppy, but because voluntary pre-arrest statements are the category of evidence least likely to be captured with absolute documentary precision. The forensic interview is probably the weakest because trained forensic interviewers are specifically prepared for this cross-examination and because juries tend to find them credible. The father's account falls somewhere in between, genuinely vulnerable to the emotional state question, but also the most emotionally charged cross-examination target, where the risk of jury backlash is highest. Legal experts who have looked at this case are genuinely divided on which window offers the best chance. That is not a talking point, that is an honest reflection of the uncertainty in a case where the defense has limited options and must choose carefully how to use each one. The detective cross-examination carries the best risk-reward ratio The forensic interview cross-examination carries the best technical ammunition if the defense can find a methodology expert credible enough to move a jury. The father's cross-examination carries the most emotional landmines, but also speaks most directly to the admission that is hardest for the defense to address through any other means. What you should be watching for as this trial unfolds is not the dramatic moments. It is not the opening statements or the prosecution's presentation of the forensic evidence or even the victim's testimony, as significant as all of those are. What you should be watching for is how sharp the cross-examinations are, how specific, how restrained. Whether Sorline finds anything concrete in the detective's documentation or the forensic interview protocol, whether his cross of the father lands as a legitimate procedural question or triggers the jury backlash that would end whatever chance the defense has, those are the moments where this trial will actually be won or lost. Not in the facts are largely not in dispute, but in the gaps between the facts and the certainty required to convict unanimously. Defense attorneys in cases like this are not miracle workers. They are not in the business of making evidence disappear. They are architects of doubt. They need one crack in the foundation, not a demolition. They need one juror, not 12. They need one question that cannot be perfectly answered, not a complete dismantling of the prosecution's case. Whether Sorline can find that crack in the notes, in the protocol, or in the confrontation is the question that will keep this trial genuinely suspenseful, even when the evidence looks, on its surface, completely overwhelming. The prosecution walks in with what looks like a closed case. The defense walks in with 3 small windows and the knowledge that only one of them needs to let enough light through. That is the trial you are about to watch, and now you know exactly what to look for when it happens. Comment below, which of the 3 cross-examination windows do you think gives the defense its best real chance? The detective's notes, the forensic interview protocol, or the father's account? Legal analysts are genuinely split on this, and I want to hear where you land, and subscribe right now because the next video in this series is the most explosive one yet. We are going to walk through what happens if Kendra Duggar cooperates with prosecutors and what her testimony against her own husband would actually look like in open court. That one is going to change everything you thought you understood about this case. Do not miss it.